the wrap up of our entire Genesis series. It's been over a year, and it's good that we're wrapping up because we have Palm Sunday and Easter, and we don't want to mess with that or overshadow that in any way. So, because of this, we're obviously gonna go a little quick, and we're gonna take a few verses from chapter 45 and a few verses from chapter 50. The theme, though, is still the same. So, chapter 45, verses 1 through 8, and then I'll move to chapter 50, verses 15 till 21. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried out, "Send everyone away from me." So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. He wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him, so dismayed were they at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come closer to me." And they came closer. He said, "I am your brother, Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are 5 more years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh, and Lord of all his house, and ruler over all the land of Egypt." Now, chapter 50, verses 15 till 21. Realizing that their father was dead, Joseph's brothers said, "What if Joseph still bears a grudge against us and pays us back in full for all the wrong that we did to him?" So they approached Joseph, saying, "Your father gave this instruction before he died. Say to Joseph, I beg you, forgive the crime of your brothers and the wrong that they did in harming you. Now therefore please forgive the crime of the servants of the God of your father." And Joseph wept when they spoke to him. Then his brothers also wept, fell down before him, and said, "We are here as your slaves." But Joseph said to them, "Do not be afraid. Am I in place of God? Even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good, in order to preserve a numerous people, as he is doing today. So have no fear. I myself will provide for you and your little ones." In this way he reassured them, speaking kindly to them. This is the turning point of the whole Joseph story, and you can hear in the culmination, in the ending of that Joseph narrative, how it wraps up so many of the themes that we've encountered in Genesis, and how it so obviously points towards a greater theme that will be developed when we get to Palm Sunday and Easter. But just so that we're all on the same page and we're all caught up to speed, let's just remember that Joseph interpreted the dreams of Pharaoh, and Joseph is now put in charge of the whole execution of a plan that would save the people. Not only the people of Egypt, but it ends up saving all of the surrounding countries and its people who come to Egypt for food and for sustenance. Eventually, the place where Jacob and his children are dwelling experience the severity of this famine, and they're thinking to themselves, "Why should we stand around here?" And Jacob sends them off. So he sends 10 of the brothers, leaving Benjamin behind. The 10 brothers come into the land. They meet Joseph, though they don't realize that that's Joseph. Joseph recognizes them, and you get a hint of some of the inner pent-up aggression that he may have had towards his brothers. He calls them spies, even though he knows who they are. He accuses them several times. They keep trying to defend themselves by saying, no, we're not spies. We're honest, good brothers. And we are actually 12 brothers, and one of the brothers is gone, which was a huge understatement considering who they were talking to. And the other brother, the youngest, is at home. And so Joseph decides to call them on their bluff. Of course, it's a test. And he says, I'm going to keep Simeon here. And you can get him back if you bring Benjamin, the youngest, back to me. This would prove to me that you're not making up this story, that you actually are who you say you are. So Simeon is left behind, and I always wonder, what did Simeon do and what role did he play in the initial selling of Joseph, that Joseph would look at him and pick him out specifically? But by the time we get to the later chapters, 43, 44, now they've reached back to their home. Jacob's upset that now he's lost two sons. He's lost Joseph, and now he's lost Simeon. And he doesn't want to lose Benjamin either. And so it's kind of funny. You would think that they would go make a decision and go back quickly for their one brother, but they don't. Because in Genesis chapter 43, we see that it's only when they ran out of food that they were then forced to decide whether to go back or not. And at that point, they say, well, we have to go back and bring Benjamin, otherwise we're all going to get in trouble. So Jacob finally allows them and admits, Judah stands and says, Reuben stands up and says, I promise I will bring Benjamin back. They come and meet Joseph again. Joseph brings them in and then frames Benjamin by putting his cup in Benjamin's bag. And as they're leaving, he goes and catches them. And they say, why would you do such a thing like this? And then as they're bringing him back, and you would imagine that the rest of the story would just be that he would imprison Benjamin forever and perhaps imprison the rest of the brothers, and the whole story could have gone in a very completely different direction at this point. But we get to chapter 45, and Joseph just breaks down at this point. He asks everyone to leave, because up until this point, he was speaking to them only via his translator. He would speak in Egyptian, and they could not understand Egyptian, and so they had apparently an Egyptian to Hebrew translator on staff. Everyone left, and now he speaks directly to them, most likely at this point speaking in Hebrew, which would have really thrown them off. And he reveals himself twice to the brothers. The first time he reveals himself to them is in verse 3. He says, I'm Joseph. How's Dad? He's not concerned about anything other than his father back home, the one who loved him so much. And you get, at least here, the first insight into what has been bottled up over all these years. It's not aggression. It's not vengeance. It's not revenge. But it's just this longing to be back with his father. He misses him. He knows that his father probably doesn't know what happened to him as well. And so his very first thing after admitting who he is to say, how is our father? My father is what he calls him. This completely freezes the brothers. They don't know how to respond. And in order to kind of keep the story going, perhaps, he then reveals himself again and says, I'm Joseph, your brother. And he says, do not be dismayed, or do not be distressed, and do not be angry with yourself. This is something extremely profound here. It would make perfect sense that Joseph would want to imprison them for a few years at least. Let them see what it's like. Let them know how it feels to be betrayed and abandoned, and to feel like there's no hope in sight. But he doesn't do that, and he doesn't even call them out and make them feel bad. He calls them out, but then he doesn't want them to feel bad. He says, do not be dismayed, do not be distressed. There's this feeling that probably struck them. And the NRSV version that I have uses the word dismayed, but the more literal translation is probably just they were horrified when they found out who it was that they were talking to. This is the person that they treated so bad. And for especially between that first revelation and that second revelation, there's this moment where they realize that there's a 99% chance that we're busted here. But there's still that 1% chance that maybe he doesn't know us like we think he does. And it's when he says, I'm your brother, the one you sold into Egypt. There's no doubt at this point. They know that they've been caught. They know that there's no escape, that there's no hiding it. But then they're confronted not with justice at this point. They're confronted with not even just great mercy, but they're confronted with grace. Now, we've talked about this idea back in the story of Noah's Ark, a story that we normally think in terms of as God getting angry and killing everyone, but we read it and then we understood that, oh, actually, this is a story about God loving the world so much that he wouldn't allow us to spoil it. So he cleansed it and preserved a remnant so that it would continue on. And so we saw that there were notions of justice combined with mercy and then covered in grace. There are many times in the Bible where we deal and have to deal with issues of justice, especially the believing community when they're the ones who are acting in an unjust manner towards others. The prophets, like especially Amos, will say justice matters to God. We need to be just. We need to uphold justice. But that's not the whole story. And so just like in the rest of the prophetic writings, just like in the story of Noah, like we see in this story with Joseph, he goes one step further and says, listen, the point of me revealing myself to you is not to make you feel bad. It's to get back into being a family again, to restoring the relationship that we once had. He goes one step further, and then mercy would go, which would just be to not give them what they deserve, not giving them the punishment that is owed to them. But instead, he gives them what they do not deserve, which is redemption, which is all the provisions and more that they could possibly have ever imagined. Genuine forgiveness. Genuine forgiveness does not linger on the sin, but instead it focuses on the restoration. When you think about the story of Peter being restored in John chapter 21, I know we're getting ahead of ourselves in the lectionary calendar, but you all know the story. Post-resurrection, Jesus encounters Peter, who had denied him 3 times. You had heard me say this before, that he sees a charcoal fire. The same charcoal fire that is in John chapter 18. The same charcoal fire that is actually not found anywhere else in the Bible. This word of this kind of fire is only in these 2 places. He would have remembered exactly what he had done. And yet, Jesus does not dwell on his sin, but dwells on his restoration, dwells on his commissioning, dwells on his redemption. Peter would have had the exact same feeling that Joseph's brothers had. Why do I say that? Because when the Old Testament ends up getting translated into Greek in the Septuagint, the Greek word that they use to describe the distress of the brothers is the very same word they use when they say that Peter felt hurt, that Jesus asked him for a 3rd time, "Do you love me?" There's something interesting about that concept. God doesn't want us to feel the pain, but yet he doesn't prevent us from feeling it. And in fact, he draws us to that experience. There's so many times when we want to bypass the cross, the recognition of our faults and our sins, and just go straight to the redemption side. Let's go straight to that empty tomb. But there's no way to get there. The path has to go through this very difficult moment of being busted, like the brothers were. Let me put it this way. If we don't feel remorse or pain over the sins that we do commit, well, it probably means that we don't realize that we've done something wrong. But if we end up wallowing and staying in that feeling of guilt and condemnation, then we probably don't realize what God is currently doing. So on one hand, if we don't recognize the pain that we've caused to God, that means we don't know what we're doing. But if we stay stuck in that pain, then that means that we don't recognize the redemption that God is doing. And so we have to go through both of these experiences in order to come out on the other end. There ought to be a sense of heaviness when we sin, when we go astray from God, when we wrong a brother and a sister. So often we suppress that feeling. We say, I'm the innocent one. They're the one who did something wrong. Joseph was the one who was being an arrogant brat. It was his fault that he went around making up these stories about how he's going to be great. They could have thought all of these things, but in that moment, Joseph recognized that they made a confession. Now, let me put another very important question before you. How can we possibly experience forgiveness if we never confess? Without confession, there can be no experience of forgiveness. And I'm very careful with choosing those words, because I know very well, just like you all know very well, that on the cross, Jesus said, Father, forgive them for what they do. They never asked for that forgiveness. They never confessed their sins. But the key is in experiencing forgiveness. You and I, we cannot experience forgiveness unless we confess, unless we realize and acknowledge what we've done wrong. All the hours that we spent not studying the Word of God, not devoting ourselves to a holy God, if you recall our morning study. In many places, confession is verbal. In the Marthoma Church, we have a prayer of confession that we ask you to say out loud. The psalmists and many other places within the Bible understand the importance of speech, of getting that thing out of your mouth and declaring it. Not only so your own ears can hear it, but so that the community can hear it. There's something very important in that. Having said that, they didn't confess out loud. There was instead a silent sort of confession. There can be at times the same sort of silent confession that takes place. It's a confession that Joseph could see. And it's a kind of confession that God can see. When you come into his presence and you may not have the words to articulate it, but you know that you're not in the right path. And you come with a sense of brokenness, a sense of contrition. God sees that. And that grieving heart, that broken heart, God does not despise it. Instead, he welcomes it. And so there's this very strange paradox that in the moment of our absolute vulnerability and exposure is the simultaneous moment that we can experience God's welcoming, forgiving love. It's only in that way that we can experience it, in fact. All those small inner thoughts that we have, God sees them. There's no potential of hiding it. And yet, we still have this tendency to feel as if God won't remember what we did, right? He's not going to He's not going to keep track of all of these things, will he? Of course he does. Just like Joseph, over all those years, he still remembered exactly what his brothers did. So too, God remembers every single thing. And this is the beautiful part of grace. Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 34, and it ends up getting quoted in the New Testament for all the New Testament fans out there. In Hebrews chapter 8, verse 12, for I will be merciful towards their sins. I will remember their sins no more. God doesn't forget. This is poetic language. God is saying he will not count them against us. He will not consider them against us. He won't hold them against us. And so in so many interesting ways, when we as a community try to suppress our guilt in order to give the appearance of being all put together, when we do that, there's no chance to experience the forgiveness that God actually freely gives. And so sometimes that suppression of our obvious awareness of the guilt, it manifests itself in different ways. For some people, it manifests in an overconfidence. I am, of course, better than I claim or you claim me to be. I'm better than you. I'm better than everyone. I'm a holy person. And then there's others who will manifest it in a very timid way. They'll beat themselves up. They'll feel like there's no hope for them. What business do I have entering into the house of God? What business do I have even trying to be a good follower of Christ, because I can't live up to that kind of a lifestyle? They're two extreme ends that stem from one same problem. We are not able to expose our guilt before God and realize that he doesn't care about it, that he cares about redemption, that he cares about bringing us back. As we're moving towards Passion Week, we need to go through these two experiences. A deep awareness that God knows our faults, along with a deep awareness that he will not recall them anymore, because he looks at us and sees his son. Let's move forward. In this story, there's another very interesting idea that pops up that we've talked about, thankfully, over the last 6 weeks, and that's this idea of God's sovereignty and the interplay of God's sovereignty and human freedom. So in Genesis chapter 45, verses 5 and in verse 7, both times, and then even when you turn to chapter 50, again, he says it. Joseph says, God did all of this. God meant it for good. God is the one who planned this all out so that I could be here at the right time to make sure that you all have provisions. Now, don't mishear that. Don't mishear that and think that what Joseph is saying is, don't worry, brothers. I know that God forced you all to do that to me and that you had no role to play, but that God was just, he needed me to be here. That's not what is being taught. We're not being taught of a sovereignty of God that overrides their responsibility and their decision-making abilities. Instead, we see a sovereignty of God that overrides even their mistakes, that overrides even their disobedience, so that he still can orchestrate his grand plan. But then we should also be very careful to not miss out on the greater point. The point of this isn't to say that, oh, don't worry, even if you mess up, God is going to fix things in the end. The point is to say that through obedience, God accomplishes his will. That's the real point of the story, because it's through the obedience of Joseph in Potiphar's house, in the house of Pharaoh, and while he was in prison, and then when he becomes elevated to that great position next to Pharaoh, it was in Joseph's obedience that we are able to see how God orchestrates all these things together. Obedience is the sovereignty of God that he makes happen through you, your choices, and my choices. And it's the thing that's able to transform failures. Look at how Joseph was able to restore his brothers. it wasn't an act of God other than the grace that Joseph was able to convey to them. It was Joseph's obedience and his love and his faithfulness in bringing them back that now enables them to say those failures itself have been redeemed. When we think about obedience in our own lives, we ought not to look at it so lightly. Perhaps we are coming from a culture where there are many rules, and we think that as long as we follow certain rules, then we're okay. Even in the Western culture, there's this idea that says that as long as I don't do certain things, then I'm fine. As long as I don't make those mistakes that Joseph's brothers made, then I'm part of God's plan. It's not fully the truth. Because if you really want to be part of God's actual doing in this world, then you have to coincide your will with His and do the things that He calls you to do. Now, this principle of understanding that God is able to work all of those things in my past life towards a good, because I submit my life to Him and because we obey Christ and God, it's very easy to apply that in hindsight. The challenge now is to apply it as we look forward into the unknown. Joseph, to some degree, is able to look forward and say, listen, 2 years have passed, but there's 5 more years of famine coming. And all of these things that have happened, it still has a purpose for us as we go forward. But I wonder if any of them understood how Exodus is going to open it. That there would be still a greater tragedy that is going to happen. But it ends up being part of the greatest and most transformative and identity-forming stories of the Israelite people and of the Christian community compared to any other story in the entire Old Testament, the Exodus. God has a plan, but that plan can best be experienced and the sovereignty can best be enjoyed when we obey Him. This is why it's really cool when you read things from a very different perspective of a person who sees complete chaos and nonsense in the world around and yet can come to the conclusion, obey God and follow His commands. You know that hopefully is the entire summation of the book of Ecclesiastes. That though everything looks like it's not under God's sovereignty, though everything seems as though you have no role to play and can't make a difference in this world because everything is just going to be what it is, even though it seems that way, he still concludes by saying, just trust God. Just obey Him because He has a plan in everything, through everything. We as Christians, of course, we know this when we look at the cross. But do we know this when we look at what's going to happen in the months to come? There might be a sense of joy and expectation looking forward to our Easter reopening. And of course, let that joy be there. But after this, there's going to be something else. I don't know what it is. Nobody knows what it is. But it's going to come. And when it comes, can we be prepared for it? Can we be in line with God's will and obedient to it? Whether it be something socially, which seems a bit abstract, or whether bring it home and you face some sort of crisis in your own personal life in the days to come. God is preparing you now for those events. As long as you can be obedient to Him, you'll be ready to see it. You'll be able to understand, oh, this is God's hand. This is Him moving in our lives. Now, let's kind of wrap it all up. Joseph was betrayed. Joseph was mistreated. He was handed over to death. And unexpectedly, he didn't die. He wasn't kept down. He reappears to his brothers. He shows up. And he offers not only forgiveness, but he offers a new beginning. Sound familiar? Yeah, of course, because it sounds exactly like the story of Jesus. But before we go there, because that's the obvious place to go, it's easy to identify Christ in the Old Testament. It's a little bit harder and a more humbling aspect to recognize ourselves in the Old Testament, because we are the brothers in the story. We're the ones who betrayed Jesus. We're the ones who sold him. We're the ones who go around pretending like we didn't do anything wrong about it. And we ought to be the ones who have our hearts broken before him, experiencing the pain of what we've caused him on the cross, but then instantaneously also feeling the joy, overwhelming joy, of being welcomed into his kingdom. There's no other way to get to Easter unless we journey through the cross and realize not only Christ on the cross, but us who put him there on the cross. And so as we recognize Christ in the Old Testament, let's also be clear that this is a book that's meant to reveal who we are in front of him. So may the good Lord strengthen us to be humble in his presence, that we ought not to think of ourselves more highly than we ought to, as Paul said to the Philippians in chapter 2, but that we would humble ourselves down, that we would empty ourselves as Christ did for us. So may the good Lord strengthen us by those words. Amen.